Snow had been falling since dusk, the kind that muffled the world into a false peace. By the time midnight bells echoed faintly across the highland village, the ground lay smooth and unbroken, a white sheet pulled tight over roofs, lanes, and the dark moor beyond. It was beneath that immaculate cover that the trouble waited. Mrs. Morag Maclean was found just after dawn, sprawled neatly at the centre of her sitting-room, hands folded as if in prayer, eyes open and fixed on the frosted window. She had been stabbed once, clean and precise, directly through the heart. There was no sign of a struggle. No overturned furniture, no broken glass, no blood beyond the small dark bloom soaking into her tartan rug. The door had been bolted from the inside. The windows were shut and latched. Outside, the snow beneath them lay untouched, smooth as a freshly iced cake. The first constable on the scene had walked the perimeter twice, boots crunching where his steps alone disturbed the surface. No footprints led to the cottage, none led away. The chimney was too narrow for a child, let alone a grown man. The back door was as secure as the front. The village, still half drunk on mulled wine and goodwill, buzzed with the same impossible question: how did anyone get in? The clue, when it was noticed, seemed almost mocking. On the small side table beside the body lay a single sprig of holly, bright red berries glossy against the dark green leaves. It hadn't fallen from anywhere. There was no decoration nearby, no wreath missing a piece. Mrs. Maclean was known to despise festive clutter. She'd said so often enough. The holly looked placed, deliberate, like a calling card, and yet no one could say what it meant. Hamish Macbeth arrived as the sun lifted weakly over the hills, turning the snow pink and gold. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, hat pulled low, eyes moving slowly across the room. To anyone else it was a picture of calm order, interrupted by death. To Hamish it was too orderly. People did not die tidily unless someone wanted them to. He crouched by the body, noting the angle of the wound, the absence of defensive cuts. Mrs. Maclean had trusted whoever stood before her, or hadn't had time to be afraid. The holly caught his eye last. He picked it up carefully, turning it between his fingers. Freshly cut. No sap dried along the stem. It hadn't been there long. Outside, villagers clustered in anxious knots, their breath steaming, voices hushed as if the snow itself were listening. Hamish walked the short path around the cottage again, though he already knew what he'd find. Nothing. The snow told no lies. That was what made it dangerous. It erased as much as it revealed. Inside, he tested the bolt on the door. Solid. Old, but well cared for. He checked the windows, then the fireplace, then the narrow cupboard where Mrs. Maclean kept her preserves. Everything in its place. Too much in its place. He straightened and let his gaze drift back to the window. Frost had crept inward in delicate fern patterns, but in one corner there was a clear patch, thumb-sized, where the ice had been wiped away. Hamish leaned closer. Someone had stood there recently, peering out. Or in... The timeline formed itself quietly in his mind. Mrs. Maclean alone on Christmas night, hearing something outside. Perhaps a familiar voice calling softly, not wishing to wake the neighbours. She opens the door just long enough to let in cold air and one trusted person. The bolt slides back into place afterward. The snow continues to fall, obediently covering the brief disturbance. The holly was not a signature from a stranger, Hamish decided, but a message meant for her, a reminder, something from the past dressed up as Christmas cheer. The village would say it was random festive nonsense. That was what the killer wanted, but holly in these parts was used only for one thing, marking graves in winter when flowers were gone. Hamish looked once more at Mrs. Maclean's calm, accusing eyes and felt the familiar tightening in his chest. The crime looked impossible because it wasn't meant to be solved quickly. It was meant to sit beneath the snow, quiet and cold, until everyone stopped asking questions. He stepped back into the white morning, already knowing that the first answer was never the right one, and that Christmas, in a small village, gave killers more places to hide than any storm ever could. The villagers watched Hamish Macbeth in the same way they always did, politely, cautiously, with the faint hope that if they stayed quiet enough, he might somehow fix everything without involving them. He ignored the stares and the murmurs, and focused instead on the Maclean cottage, already feeling that familiar irritation with crimes that pretended to be clever. The doctor arrived, red-nosed and flustered, confirming what Hamish already knew. Time of death somewhere between 10 and midnight. Quick, clean, no hesitation. The sort of wound delivered by someone who either knew exactly what they were doing or knew the victim well enough not to miss. While the doctor worked, 2 uniformed officers went through the motions, opening drawers, checking cupboards, making notes that would say very little later on. Hamish let them. Routine had its uses, it made people careless. He drifted instead toward the mantelpiece. Mrs. McLean had kept it bare, save for a single framed photograph pushed slightly off-centre. Hamish straightened it automatically, then paused. The dust beneath showed a clean rectangle, but the photo itself carried a faint smear across the glass, as though it been handled recently. He leaned closer. It showed Mrs. McLean as a younger woman, standing beside a man in military dress, both of them stiff, unsmiling. The man's face had been rubbed almost smooth by repeated touch. Hamish replaced the frame exactly where he'd found it. Outside, he called over one of the constables and asked who had reported the body. The answer came quickly: Angus Grant, the nearest neighbour. He'd gone over early, worried when he saw no smoke from the chimney. A sensible thing, everyone agreed. Angus had always been sensible. Hamish went to find him. Angus Grant stood apart from the others, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, staring at the snow like a man studying a complicated problem. He jumped slightly when Hamish approached, then forced a smile that never reached his eyes. "Terrible business," Angus said at once. "Just terrible." "Poor Morag." Hamish nodded. "You were close to her?" "Aye. Neighbours for years." Angus swallowed. She wasn't an easy woman, mind, but she didn't deserve this. Hamish watched him as he spoke, noting the way Angus shifted his weight, grinding his heel into the snow again and again. The snow there was already churned, muddied by boots, but just beyond it, near the cottage wall, Hamish spotted something small and dark, half buried in white. He crouched and brushed it free. A button. Brass, dulled with age, the sort you found on old coats rather than modern ones. It was cold to the touch, as if it had been lying there longer than the rest of the disturbed snow, longer perhaps than Angus was admitting. Hamish turned it over slowly in his palm. Angus followed the movement with his eyes before catching himself and looking away. "You didn't notice anything last night?" Hamish asked mildly. Angus hesitated a fraction too long. "No, quiet as ever. Snow muffles sound, you know." "Aye," Hamish agreed. "It does." He slipped, pegged the button into his pocket and wandered back toward the cottage, leaving Angus to stare after him, jaw clenched tight. Inside, the officers were finishing up, boredom already creeping into their movements. Hamish asked them to wait a moment longer. He returned to the holly sprig on the table and looked at it again, then at the window. Outside that pane, half hidden by frost, was another faint mark in the snow, a shallow crescent where someone had stood close to the wall, careful, almost pressed against it. Too careful for a casual passer-by. Hamish's mind ticked forward. A visitor late at night. Someone expected. Someone who knew Mrs. McLean would open the door without raising alarm. Someone who also knew how to leave no obvious trace, except they had underestimated the snow, and they had underestimated him. He asked around quietly, listening more than he spoke. People offered the same details with small variations. Mrs. McLean kept to herself. She had no family nearby. She'd argued with Angus last month about a strip of land near the burn. She had once been engaged, long ago, to a man who'd never returned from service. Each fact lay harmless on its own, but together they formed an uneasy shape. Back inside, Hamish stood once more by the body. The holly, the photograph, the white patch of frost, the button in his pocket, they all pointed somewhere, but not cleanly. Someone had planned this, but not perfectly. Emotion had crept in where precision should have been. As he stepped outside again, the snow began to fall anew, soft and steady, eager to erase what little remained. Hamish pulled his collar up and glanced toward Angus Grant, who now stood with the others, laughing too loudly at something that wasn't funny. The deception had begun to show its edges, not enough yet, but enough for Hamish Macbeth to know that beneath the Christmas snow the truth was already star. Ugling to breathe, Hamish let the snow fall for a while before he began asking harder questions. People spoke more freely once the initial shock settled into something closer to gossip. and in a small village, gossip carried truth the way peat carried fire. Slowly, but it burned all the same. He started with Angus Grant again, not because Angus was the most suspicious, but because he wanted to see if the man's story had changed. They stood in Angus's kitchen, steam rising from 2 untouched mugs of tea. Angus talked quickly, as though speed might outrun scrutiny. "I told you I didn't hear a thing," Angus said. "Went to bed early. Weather makes you sleepy, and yet you were the first to notice no smoke from Morag's chimney," Hamish said mildly. Angus shrugged. "Habit. I always look, even on Christmas morning." Another pause, short but sharp. "Especially then." Hamish nodded, as if satisfied, and asked about the argument over the land. Angus waved it away too easily. "Nothing worth killing over. She was stubborn, that's all. Wouldn't listen to reason." "Whose reason?" Hamish asked. Angus laughed a brittle sound. "Anyone's but her own." Hamish left him then, carrying the impression of a man who'd rehearsed his innocence so thoroughly he'd forgotten to sound natural. Next came Mrs. Elspeth Kerr, who lived across the lane and had watched the cottage windows as faithfully as some people watch television. She ushered Hamish in with trembling hands and a rush of words. "I saw a light," she said before he could ask. "Late. Around 11, I'd say. Inside or outside?" Hamish asked. "Inside, of course. Morag's sitting room. I thought she'd had company." "Did you see anyone arrive?" Elspeth hesitated. "No. But the snow was thick by then. You wouldn't see much? You didn't hear anything?" "No." "But—" She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "I thought I heard talking early." "Ah, just before 10. A man's voice." Hamish filed that away. "You recognise it?" Elspeth shook her head. Could have been anyone. Or someone she didn't want to name, Hamish thought. At the shop, he spoke to young Ian MacDougall, who had delivered groceries to Mrs. Maclean twice a week. Ian was eager, too eager, to be helpful. She was nervous lately, Ian said. Kept checking the door, like she expected trouble. Did she say why? No. But she asked me once if people ever really changed. Ian swallowed. "Strange thing to ask, isn't it?" "Depends who you're asking about," Hamish replied. Ian flushed. "I didn't mean brah." Hamish smiled faintly and moved on. Why, midday the stories had formed a loose, uneasy chorus. Mrs. Maclean was private, difficult, recently unsettled. People remembered arguments they'd once dismissed, visits they'd half seen through curtains. No one admitted to being close to her, but everyone claimed to know her well enough to explain her habits. The contradictions weren't loud, they whispered. Those were the dangerous ones. Back at the cottage, Hamish stood again in the sitting room, listening to the house itself. Old buildings remembered things. He picked up the photograph from the mantel and turned it over. A name was written on the back, faint with age, Alastair. No surname, just a first name, intimate and unfinished. Hamish thought of the holly, of graves marked in winter, of things that never quite stayed buried. The late afternoon, he found the one person who hadn't volunteered anything at all, Ewan Fraser, the retired gamekeeper who lived near the edge of the moor. Ewan answered the door with narrowed eyes and said nothing until Hamish spoke, bar. "You were out last night," Hamish said gently. "It wasn't a question, bar." One's jaw tightened. "I walked the boundary. Snow coming in, brr. You passed Mrs. Maclean's place." "I, brr." "Did you stop?" "Brr, no, brr. He." Answer came too fast. Hamish studied him. "You served with Alastair, didn't you?" Ewan's breath caught just slightly. "Long time ago. And you knew Morag? Knew of her?" Hamish nodded, satisfied for now. As he turned away, Ewan spoke again, voice rough. "Some things don't forgive time," he said. Outside, the light was already fading, the snow beginning to fall once more. Hamish pulled his coat tighter and looked back at the cottage, now dark and silent. The voices he'd heard all day echoed in his head, overlapping, contradicting, circling one truth they were careful not to touch. Someone in this village had come to Morag Maclean that night carrying more than a knife. They had brought memory, resentment, and something sharp enough to cut through years of quiet, and Hamish Macbeth could feel it now, pressing closer, as the lies began to thin beneath the Christmas snow. The village fell into a brittle silence, as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the snow. Hamish Macbeth moved slowly, retracing the threads he had begun to pull. Each person he had spoken with carried a fragment of truth, but none of it fit neatly. He felt the old familiar itch, the puzzle that insisted on its own logic, one layer at a time. Angus Grant's alibi was the first to unravel in Hamish's mind. He had insisted on being in bed early, yet he was the first to notice the absence of smoke. It was a minor inconsistency, easily dismissed, but Hamish had learned to trust the small deviations. People rarely lied perfectly, not even in panic. The land dispute Angus mentioned seemed trivial at first glance, but property disputes in a small village had a way of breeding bitterness. Even Mrs. Maclean's sharp tongue could not erase the quiet satisfaction some felt at seeing her thwarted. Greed was always patient. Mrs. Elspeth Kerr, on the other hand, seemed innocuous until Hamish Rep laid her account. "A man's voice before 10, she said, though she couldn't identify it, a detail that seemed trivial. Yet it conflicted with Angus's insistence on having heard nothing. Elspeth's nervous energy, the tremor in her hands, the rapid-fire way she spoke, it suggested more than a casual observation. Fear or guilt? Perhaps both. Hamish filed it away as a possibility. Ian MacDougall, with his eagerness to impress, revealed emotional motives that might have been buried beneath filial loyalty or curiosity. Why would a boy speak so earnestly about a woman's nervous habits, except to direct attention somewhere or away from himself? Hamish noted the way Ian's eyes darted whenever the subject of strangers in the village came up. It was the subtle deflection he had learned to watch for. Then there was Ewan Fraser, the stoic figure who refused to volunteer information. His terse acknowledgement of knowing Alastair, Morag's lost love, presumably, spoke of old grudges, unfinished business. Time had not erased resentment, Hamish realised, nor had it dulled memory. Ewan's silence carried weight, and the fleeting hesitation in his voice betrayed more than he wanted anyone to hear. Revenge, Hamish thought, quiet, patient, and deadly. The photograph of Alastair, pressed into the mantle, returned to Hamish's mind. Whoever Morag had loved, or been loved by, had left their mark. The holly, fresh and deliberate, was a message. But what was it signalling? A warning? A remembrance? The threads tangled further. Hamish began mapping connections silently. Angus and the land, Elspeth and the mysterious voice, Ian and his boyish zeal, Ewan and old wounds. Everyone had opportunity, and almost everyone had reason. Fear, jealousy, and greed swirled in a dizzying pattern. Hamish returned to the small brass button he had found in the snow. It seemed insignificant until he traced it against the coats of the suspects. Angus had nothing to match. Ian's coat was new. Ewan's old tweed held buttons that had been polished recently, though not like this one. But the shape, the weight, the age, it suggested someone who had worn it often, carried it as part of habit, maybe even as part of identity. Someone who moved with certainty through the village, accustomed to cold and snow, and unconcerned with leaving evidence. Someone familiar with Mrs. Maclean, intimately so. He thought of the night itself, reconstructed in layers, a man's voice before 10, a light flickering in the sitting room, the precise strike that ended a life, the single sprig of holly left as a mark, the careful wiping of frost from the window. Everything was deliberate, yet human error had crept in, a single button lost, a footprint half hidden, a memory spoken too loudly. Hamish realised that no single motive explained it all. Greed might have driven Angus to confront Morag, but it would not explain the holly, the photograph, or the precise timing. Old wounds might have driven Ewan toward a violent impulse, but they would not account for Ian's nervous revelations or Elspeth's half-hidden observations. The crime was layered, each suspect carrying a thread, none of them complete on its own. By nightfall, Hamish paced the cottage floor once more, tracing patterns with his eyes. The snow outside lay undisturbed again, a soft, misleading blanket that suggested nothing had happened. But beneath it, beneath the facades and the polite lies, a maze of motives twisted tight. And somewhere in that maze was the truth, a single spark that had set all the tensions aflame and left Morag MacLean lying still beneath the Christmas snow. Hamish felt it as clearly as the cold seeping through the floorboards. The solution would require untangling not just opportunity and alibi, but memory, fear, and a heart-long train. In silence, morning arrived pale and grey, the snow crusted and brittle beneath Hamish Macbeth's boots. The village had already begun whispering of closure. The brass button he had found, carefully catalogued by the constables, had been linked to Angus Grant's overcoat. By midday, gossip had solidified into near certainty. Angus had been caught, and the case, at least in the eyes of the authorities, was solved. A few officers congratulated themselves, and the constable in charge even dared a small smile of triumph. The villagers nodded politely, relieved that the shadow hanging over Christmas seemed to lift. Hamish observed all of this quietly, though a cold knot had settled in his stomach. The brass button fit, yes, but fit too neatly. He had seen the pattern before. Authorities eager to close a case would seize the first piece that aligned with their assumptions, ignoring the broader web of circumstances that didn't quite match. He wondered if Angus's mild evasions, the half-truths, had made him the perfect scapegoat. The constable marched Angus to the station, the man's jaw tight and eyes restless. He did not protest, which Hamish found curious, but the boyish flicker of unease in his gaze suggested a man caught off balance, not guilty. Onlookers murmured, one less worry before the feast, the story complete. Yet Hamish's mind tugged at the loose threads. The photograph, the holly, the half-hidden footprint, all of it seemed to persist stubbornly, resistant to the neat conclusion the others celebrated. He could not ignore that feeling. He returned to the MacLean cottage. Inside, the faint smell of smoke lingered from the kettle that had long since boiled dry, mingling with the sharper scent of disinfectant. Hamish walked the familiar path from mantelpiece to window, touching nothing, listening. Nothing had changed, yet the room felt heavier somehow, charged with a 10. Sion, that the village's relief had overlooked. The small, precise crime had left a larger echo than anyone wanted to admit. He examined the holly again, fresh leaves glinting under the soft light, and wondered about its message. Someone had wanted to mark something, but not for Angus. Whoever had left it had known it would mislead, would signal false intent, the sort that lulls investigators into a premature certainty. Hamish felt that instinctively, a tug deeper than logic alone. The button was too easy, the motive too obvious. Real criminals, he thought, always leave clues that promise answers and hide the real ones behind layers of expectation. Even as the village buzzed with talk of the arrest, Hamish returned to witnesses who had spoken with him the day before. Elspeth Kerr avoided his eyes, her nervous energy sharpened. Ian MacDougall still fidgeted, too willing to offer connections between villagers and Morag's habits, eager for recognition. Ewan Fraser, distant and silent, continued to haunt the edges of the investigation. Each of them carried details that didn't fit neatly into the narrative the authorities were building. Hamish began piecing them together in a way that only a practiced eye could. Small inconsistencies in timing, the selective emphasis on certain events, the unconscious gestures of guilt or concealment. None screamed murderer, but all hinted that something had been orchestrated with careful calculation. By late afternoon, Hamish walked the moor alone, boots crunching over frost-bitten grass beneath the thin snow. He traced the route a visitor might take, considering angles, distances, and concealment. It was possible to enter the cottage, strike, and leave without leaving footprints in the untouched snow, but only if the perpetrator knew the snow, the house, and Mrs. MacLean's habits intimately. Angus knew the area, yes, but not with that evil of precision, not the familiarity required to leave the holly as a message, to wipe the frost in a calculated gesture, to time the strike with the quietest interval of snowfall. The sun was sinking when Hamish returned to the village. He watched from the edge as constables congratulated each other, Angus silent and stiff, villagers nodding in relief. A sense of false security had settled over them, comforting in its simplicity. Hamish felt the unease deepen. The real murderer was still moving unseen among them, patient and deliberate. Aware that others were convinced the case was closed, he allowed himself a small, grim smile. Let them believe they had solved it. Let the village breathe a moment longer in ignorance. That sense of ease made the shadows longer, and in those shadows, Hamish knew, the truth was gathering, waiting for its moment to emerge. The crime was far from finished, and beneath the Christmas snow, the final act had yet to begin. The night was still, but Hamish Macbeth could feel it pressing against the edges of the village, thick with frost and expectation. He sat by the hearth in his small office, rolling the day over in his mind, piecing fragments into something that might hint at order. The brass button, the holly, the half-hidden footprints, all of it remained stubbornly unresolved. And yet, as he studied the photograph of Alastair pressed into the mantelpiece in Mrs. Maclean's cottage, a memory surfaced, faint but insistent. Years ago, Hamish recalled, there had been a case on the edge of the moor involving a young woman and a man recently returned from military service. The details had long blurred, a disappearance, an accusation, whispers of a feud over property and pride, and the eventual quiet closure with no conviction. He remembered the names now: Alastair Fraser, Ewan's brother, and a woman whose family had once clashed with the Maclean. The connection had been overlooked, trivialized in the eyes of the courts, dismissed as misfortune or coincidence. But Hamish felt the tug of it now, the way shadows lengthen over frozen ground, hiding what has been there all along. He returned to the cottage the next morning, boots sinking lightly into fresh snow. Inside, the room remained untouched, a shrine to order and murder alike. The photograph of Alastair, once just a face, now seemed a fulcrum. Hamish traced the worn edges of the frame, considering Ewan Fraser's words, "Some things don't forgive time." What had not been forgiven, he wondered, and why now? It became clear as he walked the village again, speaking quietly to the older residents who remembered the stories that never made it into the papers. Ewan Fraser and Mrs. Maclean had known each other long before the night of the murder, not merely as acquaintances, but through Alastair, whose death, or disappearance, depending on who told it, had left both families scarred. Morag Maclean had once been engaged to Alastair. The man's face in the photograph had been smoothed by repeated touch, yes, but also by grief, anger, and a stubborn refusal to let the past lie. Ewan had served in the same regiment as Alastair. Old loyalties, old betrayals, and old rivalries had carried weight that survived decades. Hamish revisited the witnesses in light of this new connection. Elspeth Kerr, so nervous before, had been present that night long ago, tending to small acts of kindness, observing grudges as quietly as snow falling on the moor. Ian MacDougall had no memory of that time, too young, but his eagerness now could be explained by his proximity to stories whispered in the village, shaping his view of Mrs. Maclean and her past. And Angus Grant, the accused, had been tangentially connected through property dealings long simmering since Alastair's disappearance. Greed, timing and opportunity had collided, but the spark came from old wounds, not simple avarice. Hamish returned to the brass button. In isolation it was circumstantial, but within this context it took on new meaning. A man used to moving quietly, familiar with the history, would not need to check the snow, would leave minimal traces, would strike with precision. The button had not betrayed him. The button was a remnant of the life that had led to this murder, small and overlooked, just as the past itself had been. Standing at the window, Hamish traced the path that a visitor might have taken from the edge of the moor, familiar, practiced, guided by old grievances. The footprints in the snow outside, faint and half-covered, were no longer random. They were part of a choreography written long ago. The holly, placed carefully, was a message encoded in tradition and sentiment, understood fully only by those who knew the story behind it. Morag Maclean had been confronted not by a stranger or by simple misfortune, but by history itself, incarnate in a living form of vengeance and remembrance. Hamish felt the familiar tightening in his chest. the sense that the solution, always partial until the final revelation, was close. Shadows of the past had reached forward, intertwining with the present in ways that no villager had anticipated. He knew that the real murderer was watching now, confident that the case had been closed, unaware that every carefully maintained lie and every whispered grievance was being unravelled. Beneath the Christmas snow, the past had never really slept. It had merely waited for the right moment, and Hamish Macbeth could feel that moment approaching. The snow was deeper now, drifting along the edges of the lanes, the village hushed under its weight. Hamish Macbeth stood in the Maclean cottage once more, the quiet of the room pressing against him. Invitin. G thought, rather than action. He had revisited every witness, every fragment of memory, every half-forgotten feud. The past had whispered its secrets, but he still needed the present to speak clearly. Sometimes, he knew, people told the truth only when their assumptions were challenged, not through confrontation, but through subtle misdirection. He returned to Angus Grant's cottage, pretending once more to examine minor details, the worn handle of the door, the faint scuff of boots on the floor. But all the while, his mind was elsewhere. Hamish had learned that people carried the past on their bodies, gestures, habits. Even minute reactions betrayed what the mouth attempted to hide. He had no evidence yet, no confession, but he needed a crack in the wall of confidence, a momentary lapse that would reveal what had been carefully concealed. Angus, Hamish began casually, examining the hearth. "Have you ever wondered why Mrs. Maclean kept that photograph of Alastair?" Angus stiffened, just slightly, though his eyes remained polite. "Why would I?" he asked, a touch too quickly. "Curious, isn't it?" Hamish replied, glancing over at him. "A woman keeps the portrait of a man who disappeared long ago. Not your typical souvenir." "You were around then, yes?" Angus's hands clenched involuntarily at the sides of his coat. I knew of him. Everyone did." His voice betrayed a slight edge that had not been there before. Hamish nodded, letting his gaze linger on the brass button he had brought with him. "Funny thing, that," he said softly. "A button found near the scene, old style, hardly common these days. I wonder, does it match anything you might have worn years ago?" The man blinked once, sharply, and for a fraction of a second Hamish thought he would speak, but Angus merely smiled, tight and forced, and shook his head. "I'm no fool," he said, voice carefully neutral. Hamish L. leaned forward, not in accusation, but in quiet curiosity. "Of course not, but you must understand, people do sometimes misplace buttons, and others notice them. They spark memory. Memories are better left undisturbed, I suppose." For a moment the silence was complete. Then Angus shifted on his feet, scratching at the back of his neck, a habitual gesture, but one Hamish had seen many times before. Small, almost invisible, but significant. "I told the constables everything," he muttered. "There's nothing more to say." Hamish straightened, letting the quiet fill the room. "Perhaps," he said slowly. "Or perhaps you've said what you wanted them to hear, not what actually happened." The twitch in Angus's eye, the tightening of his jaw, the slight flush to his cheeks, all told Hamish more than words could. He had not spoken outright, yet his reaction had betrayed a truth he could not hide. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but to Hamish it was a fissure in the wall of deception. The man's mind had reacted before his mouth could catch up. "Sometimes people think a crime can be neat and tidy," Hamish continued, more to himself than to Angus, "like a button that fits perfectly where it shouldn't. But the pieces that don't fit, the things that feel wrong, they always matter." Angus's shoulders slumped imperceptibly, a small sign of surrender, though he made no sound. Hamish knew this was the moment to hold back, to let the seed of doubt grow, rather than force an admission. Psychological pressure, subtle observation, sometimes it was better than confrontation. As he left the cottage, the snow drifted higher along the lane, muffling the world. Hamish walked slowly, thinking of the tiny, almost invisible reactions he had seen. Each flicker of hesitation, each involuntary gesture, each shadowed glance was a clue in itself. The real murderer had been patient, clever, careful, human all the same. Hamish knew now that the breakthrough would not come from footprints, buttons, or even grudges alone. It would come from watching, waiting, and noticing the small truths that people carried with them unconsciously. And as he moved through the hushed village, he could feel the first faint stirrings of revelation. An unusual clue, a psychological misstep, had begun to pull the web of deception toward the light, revealing the shape of the criminal lurking beneath the Christmas snow. The next morning, Hamish returned to the McLean cottage to review the traces he had catalogued. The button, the holly, the faintly wiped patch of frost. He expected calm, perhaps even clarity. Instead, he found disarray. The photograph of Alastair had been removed from the mantelpiece, leaving only the clean rectangle of dust that had been so meticulously preserved. The holly lay crushed on the floor, its leaves darkened and crushed. And most troubling of all, the brass button was missing from his pocket, vanished as though it had never existed. Hamish's stomach tightened. Someone had been here after him, someone with knowledge of the investigation and the determination to erase traces that pointed in the wrong direction. The case was no longer a simple puzzle, it was a battle for control of information. Whoever had struck last night had been patient, precise, and aware of his methods. They were close enough to anticipate his next move. He stepped carefully through the room, noting small disturbances. A faint smudge along the windowsill, dust brushed too evenly across the mantel, a faint footprint in the doorway partially covered by a thin layer of snow that had drifted in overnight. Each subtle mark told him the intruder had moved quietly, aware that noise and attention were dangerous, but the footprints were too light, almost deliberate, as if meant to mislead. Hamish walked outside, scanning the perimeter. Nothing obvious, no footprints leading toward the moor, no signs of forced entry. The snow, pristine in most places, had swallowed the evidence once again. He pressed his hands into his pockets, noting that nothing had been disturbed beyond the interior. Whoever had done this knew precisely what they wanted to remove, the physical reminders that could tie someone definitively to the crime. Returning to the village, Hamish sensed the subtle shift in mood. Rumours that had once offered clarity now seemed unreliable. Gossip reshaped to conceal rather than reveal. Even those who had seemed truthful yesterday, Elspeth, Ian, Ewan, now spoke with added caution, as though the air itself carried the threat of exposure. Hamish realised that the person who had tampered with the cottage had done more than remove objects. They had sent a message. The investigation could be manipulated, delayed, or even derailed entirely, and the perpetrator was willing to act. Hamish decided to focus on what remained. The faint smudge on the windowsill, the subtle indentation in the floor where the button had rested, the traces in the dust, all spoke of the intruder's habits. This was someone methodical, someone who revisited spaces and knew what mattered to him. He considered the suspects again, weighing their access, their knowledge, their potential motives. Angus Grant, already accused once, could have returned to reinforce the frame, but the precision and timing suggested a hand more experienced in stealth. Elspeth, nervous and watchful, might have acted out of fear or loyalty, but would she risk direct interference with a crime scene? Ian's youthful energy could be reckless, but not so subtle. That left Ewan Fraser, distant, practiced, and with decades to perfect discretion. Hamish's instincts told him that the missing evidence was no coincidence. It was deliberate, part of a strategy woven from old grudges and old knowledge. As he retraced his steps through the village lanes, Hamish noticed the subtle signs of preparation. A door slightly ajar that had previously been locked, a curtain drawn differently from the day before, a faintly shifted garden ornament. The world had become a place of small signals, coded gestures meant for those who understood the past. Whoever had removed the photograph and the button knew Hamish's methods, anticipated his movements, and sought to slow him down. By evening, Hamish returned to his office, rubbing the bridge of his nose as he considered the next move. The disappearance of the evidence had raised the stakes. The murderer was no longer reactive, merely hiding. They were proactive, striking to shape the narrative before Hamish could expose the truth. Trust had become a fragile thing. Anyone, even those closest to the investigation, could be playing a part, knowingly or unknowingly. Yet Hamish felt the faint stirrings of a solution. The removal of evidence was not only a challenge, it was also a clue. People who try to hide the past often leave a trail of their own habits behind, patterns born of long experience. The intruder had acted, yes, but in acting they had revealed something about themselves, something subtle, yet undeniable. Hamish smiled faintly to himself, feeling the old thrill of pursuit. Beneath the Christmas snow, the true story had only grown more dangerous, but he was closer than ever to uncovering it. The snow fell heavier the next morning, thick and relentless, muffling the village in a suffocating silence. Hamish Macbeth had barely stirred his tea before the first shout rang out across the street. Rushing outside, he saw a small crowd gathered near the edge of the moor, faces pale, breath rising in short clouds. Among them, Elspeth Kerr's hands trembled so violently she could barely hold herself upright. Another one," she stammered, pointing toward the path leading to the forested edge. It's Ian. He's gone." Hamish pushed through the gathering, eyes scanning the snow. The trail began faintly, a set of small footprints, haphazard, as though the person had run without care. They disappeared abruptly, where the moor dropped into thick heather and scrub. There was no indication of struggle, no overturned earth, nothing to suggest what had happened except the broken silence of the village. He knelt, brushing snow from the first footprint, noting its depth and angle. Ian MacDougall was gone. It was sudden, unanticipated, a violent punctuation that shattered the sense of progress. Hamish's mind raced. Whoever had tampered with the Maclean evidence had anticipated his moves before. Now they had escalated. This was no longer simply about hiding the past. It was about sending a warning, demonstrating that proximity to the truth carried real danger. At the Maclean cottage, Hamish scanned the room with new urgency. The absence of the photograph and button, once puzzling, now appeared as a rehearsal. The intruder had tested the waters, gauged his methods, and proven they could strike with impunity. And now a life was at stake. The village, which had begun to relax after the supposed arrest of Angus Grant, now whispered in fear, realizing that the murderer remained uncontained. Hamish retraced Ian's likely route, noting the terrain, the narrow paths, the spots where someone could hide. The snow, which had been a silent witness to the first crime, now acted as both barrier and record. Small impressions in the frost suggested that the intruder had moved quickly, but deliberately, leaving only faint traces of passage. Whoever it was, they were confident in the moor, familiar with its twists, and unafraid of being followed. Turned to the village, seeking Elspeth Kerr first. Her face was drawn, eyes wide with terror. "I didn't see him after the morning," she whispered. "But there was someone near the edge last night. I thought it was the wind, but—" She broke off, voice trembling. Hamish caught the hesitation. "You think this is the same person?" he asked gently. Elspeth nodded, unable to speak further. The implication was clear. The killer had escalated, and the pattern was deliberate. The removal of evidence, the careful misdirection, and now the disappearance. Everything pointed to a hand that was several steps ahead. Hamish felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the sense of a predator orchestrating the chaos, watching, waiting for the right moment. He sought out Ewan Fraser next, whose knowledge of the moor and its hidden paths had been essential in the past. Ewan listened quietly, lips pressed thin, eyes dark with memory. "Aye," he said finally. "Someone who knows these hills, knows them well, fast and cunning. If they wanted to take a lad, they could do it without leaving much behind." The words confirmed Hamish's fears. The case had shifted. No longer was it only about uncovering the murderer of Morag Maclean. Now it was about anticipating a mind that moved ahead of every clue, every precaution. He could no longer rely solely on observation or deduction. He needed action, planning, and the careful orchestration of countermeasures to protect the living while drawing out the killer. As night fell again, Hamish walked the village lanes alone, snow crunching softly beneath his boots. The wind carried the faint scent of pine and smoke, but beneath it he sensed the presence of something darker. The murderer had proved they could manipulate time, space, and expectation. The disappearance of Ian MacDougall was both a challenge and a threat. Hamish knew that the web had tightened, and if he did not move carefully, the next step could be fatal, not just for witnesses, but for himself. Brr. Beneath the Christmas snow, the stakes had The villain was still several steps ahead, but Hamish Macbeth, patient and watchful, felt the faint, glimmering certainty that every step the murderer took left behind traces, small, almost invisible, but undeniable. And this time, he would follow them, before another life could vanish into the cold silence of the moor. Hamish Macbeth spent the next day moving quietly through the village, revisiting the scenes, retracing his steps in thought more than in physical action. The disappearance of Ian MacDougall had cast a shadow over every corner, every familiar face, and yet it was the very familiarity that began to reveal the pattern. He observed the villagers not as friends or neighbours, but as carriers of fragments, each small gesture or repeated phrase a thread in a larger weave. E returned to the MacLean cottage, moving from room to room with a measured pace. The photograph of Alastair, now gone, still lingered in memory, a silent anchor. He noted the crushed holly on the floor, the faint smudges along the windowsill, the dust patterns that had shifted subtly when the button disappeared. Small, almost imperceptible details, each dismissed before, now began to align. The holly, a message to Morag, had been placed deliberately to be noticed. The wiped frost had been symbolic, a mark left for someone who would understand its significance. The button, brass and unassuming, had been a lure, a decoy meant to guide suspicion toward an innocent party. T was while speaking again to Elspeth Kerr that the insight struck him. She had been nervous, yes, but there was a rhythm to her hesitation, a repeated phrasing in her accounts. "I thought I saw him near the edge last night, but I wasn't sure," she had said, almost reflexively. Hamish paused on the words. Not the uncertainty, but the phrasing, the edge. It was the same phrase she had used weeks ago in passing, when describing a delivery route or a sighting of someone on the moor. At the time he had dismissed it as colloquial, now he recognised it as a clue, a habitual way of marking proximity, of noting boundaries. The murderer had exploited language, timing, and habitual movements as much as physical stealth. The footprints outside, faint and half-covered, suddenly gained meaning. They were not random. They were placed in a way that followed the contour of the moor, skirting open spaces, sticking close to walls, yet disappearing at points where the terrain offered natural concealment. Each step reflected someone intimately familiar not just with the geography, but with the psychology of anyone pursuing them. It was methodical, deliberate, and almost theatrical in its precision. Hamish retraced the steps of Ian's last known movements. The boy had delivered groceries in the morning, spoken to a handful of villagers, and been seen heading toward the forested edge. It had seemed impulsive at first, a panic perhaps, but when Hamish overlaid the sequence with Elspeth's phrasing, the footprint patterns, and the previous tampering with the MacLean evidence, a picture emerged. The criminal had orchestrated everything as a sequence. Remove the misleading evidence, draw the detective's attention, manipulate the villagers' assumptions, then strike again to heighten fear. It was a choreography, and each accident or disappearance had been staged to appear isolated, but in truth they were interconnected movements in a single plan. Even the villagers' behaviours now fit into place. Angus Grant's nervous energy, the subtle deflection of Ewan Fraser, the eager oversharing of Ian, all were part of a living tableau shaped by the murderer's presence. Some were unwitting participants, others mere distractions, but all were elements in a pattern that stretched across the village, like frost across a whin. Dopain, delicate, deliberate, and nearly invisible until viewed from the right perspective. Hamish felt the familiar tightening of focus. The murderer had left subtle cues, tiny inconsistencies, habitual gestures that now illuminated motive, opportunity, and method. It had all been in plain sight, the phrase "the edge," the crushed holly, the wiped frost, the brass button, even the timing of the snowfalls. The clues had existed not as grand gestures but as small, precise signals, waiting for someone patient enough to notice the rhythm, to connect the deliberate dots across days and spaces. He stood by the window, looking out at the moor, tracing in his mind the path of the intruder, the sequence of events, the psychological manipulation. The pattern emerged, clear now. Every act had a purpose, every misdirection a meaning, every disappearance a calculated step. The chaos of the past days was no longer a series of random incidents. It was a design, a map of intent laid bare by observation, patience, and intuition. Hamish Macbeth knew with a quiet certainty that the final move would reveal the murderer completely, and that the key to stopping them had been hidden in plain sight all along. Hamish Macbeth spent the evening in quiet contemplation, tracing the threads of the case through his mind like the slow, deliberate lines of frost forming on a windowpane. Every detail, the button, the holly, the footprints, the phrasing, the disappearances, now followed a discernible pattern, but the motive remained elusive. Greed, old grudges, jealousy, these could explain some of the acts, but they failed to illuminate the heart of what had driven the murderer to such meticulous cruelty. It was only when he returned to the MacLean cottage, standing once again in the dim light of the sitting-room, that the revelation struck. The photograph of Alastair, though gone, still haunted the Tailpiece in memory. Hamish thought of Ewan Fraser, of the distant, silent way he had observed events, the faint tremor in his voice when speaking of the past. And then, most importantly, he considered Morag MacLean herself, not as the victim, but as the keeper of a secret that had outlasted decades. The realization formed slowly, methodically, like snow settling over the hills. This crime had not been about immediate gain or petty revenge. It was about the preservation of memory, about the eradication of a narrative that the murderer could not endure. Ewan Fraser had lived with a shadow that stretched across decades. Alastair's disappearance, the broken engagements, the perceived betrayals, and Morag's refusal to acknowledge the past publicly. Every slight, every whispered rumour had festered in a mind trained to calculate, to anticipate, to control. The murder, the removal of evidence, the disappearance of Ian MacDougall, all were extensions of that same psychological imperative: to erase what had been, to control the story, to enforce a version of history where the pain, shame, and personal loss that had haunted Ewan remained unchallenged and hidden. Barbara. Hamish considered the holly, crushed but deliberate. A symbol of memory, of tradition, of something once cherished. Its placement and destruction were not random acts, they were calculated messages. The photograph of Alastair, rubbed smooth from repeated touch, revealed a fixation that had never faded, a grief twisted into obsession. The brass button, seemingly trivial, was part of a broader tableau meant to mislead, to redirect suspicion onto another while the real intent was being pursued with meticulous patience. Villagers, seemingly innocuous characters, the nervous Elspeth, the eager Ian, even the well-meaning Angus Grant, had been drawn into the web, their actions manipulated by a mind that understood both fear and trust. The disappearance of Ian was not impulsive, it was a demonstration, a show of dominance, a reminder that proximity to the truth could be dangerous. The murderer's psychology was rooted not in rage alone, but in the obsessive need to control how the past was remembered and who would be allowed to witness it. Hamish understood now why Ewan had remained silent for so long. His restraint had been deliberate, his patience calculated over years, waiting for the right moment to act decisively. The previous tampering with evidence, the careful timing of each step, the almost theatrical manipulation of events, all were designed to create a narrative of confusion, while the real story, and the real culpability, remained buried beneath layers of assumed logic and village chatter. He sat by the window, watching the snow drift steadily over the landscape, and considered the scope of what had been revealed. This was not a crime of passion or opportunistic greed. It was an act of obsession, a psychological crusade in which the murderer sought to enforce a version of reality that conformed to their perception of justice, of honour, and of closure. The depth of it, Hamish realised, explained the precision, the patience, and the cruelty. The villain had not been satisfied with one act. They needed control, dominance, and the ability to dictate the outcome entirely. The hidden motive, once revealed, cast everything into a chilling clarity. Each seemingly minor detail, the choice of objects, the timing, the victims selected, was now intelligible, coherent, part of a single horrifying logic. Hamish felt a familiar resolve tighten in his chest. Understanding the why gave him leverage. He now knew the measure of the danger, the mind he faced, and the lengths to which the murderer would go to preserve their version of history. Beneath the Christmas snow, the truth was not only waiting, it was deliberate, patient, and almost within reach, if he could anticipate the next move before the obsession claimed another life. Hamish Macbeth spent the following morning preparing carefully, moving with the deliberate patience that had guided him through so many tangled cases. He knew the patterns now, understood the psychological impulses driving the murderer, and had traced the subtle habits that had allowed them to act unseen. Every clue, every inconsistency, every habitual phrase was a piece of the trap he would set. The village still lay beneath a heavy layer of snow, silent, oblivious, while he worked quietly to orchestrate the final act. He began by gathering the villagers who had unwittingly become part of the web: Elspeth, her hands trembling but resolute, and even Angus Grant, whose nervous energy could serve as bait without risk. He did not reveal the specifics of his plan, only instructing them to follow his guidance carefully and to remain calm. The remaining pieces, the empty spaces where Ian had vanished, the subtle clues left behind in the moor, the knowledge of Ewan Fraser's habits, would all converge tonight. As dusk fell, Hamish positioned himself at the MacLean cottage, using the familiar vantage points to watch both entrance and exit. The snow crunched softly under his boots as he traced the path he knew the murderer would take, a route influenced by the need to manipulate perceptions and assert control. He had allowed the intruder to believe they remained several steps ahead, giving them the illusion of mastery, the confidence to act recklessly. It was time for that confidence to become their undoing. A shadow moved along the edge of the moor, deliberate and measured. Hamish observed, recognizing the gait, the subtle tension in the shoulders, the habitual glance toward the cottage. Ewan Fraser, once a figure of stoic distance, now approach. Ed with the quiet inevitability of a man who believed his design was flawless. Hamish stepped into the open just enough to catch the reflection of lamplight on his face, holding the snow-dusted holly in his hand as a silent signal, a symbol whose meaning the murderer would understand immediately. Ewan stopped abruptly, eyes narrowing, mind calculating. "Hamish," he said, voice low but steady, a challenge disguised as curiosity. "I suppose you've figured it out?" Hamish remained calm, hands relaxed but attentive. "I have," he replied evenly. "I understand why you acted, and I know what you were trying to accomplish. But it ends tonight." For a moment, the only sound was the soft fall of snow, a quiet witness to the tension. Then Ewan moved, slowly at first, testing, probing, as though seeking an advantage in the open. Hamish did not flinch. He had accounted for every step, every possible deviation, every desperate attempt at flight. The snow beneath Ewan's boots, though packed by previous movements, betrayed the weight of a man who had been patient, but not invincible. "You think you can stop me with words?" Ewan said finally, frustration creeping into the measured tones. "This has been planned for decades, every move calculated, every outcome anticipated. You cannot undo what has already been set in motion." Hamish's gaze held steady. "No," he admitted quietly. "I cannot undo the past, but I can ensure that you do not claim another life to preserve it. And I can make sure the truth is known, despite your intentions." Ewan's eyes darted to the cottage, to the path along the moor, and then to the village in the distance. He realized, finally, that Hamish had anticipated not just his movements, but his psychology. The trap was simple but effective. The presence of witnesses, the careful orchestration of visibility, the subtle cues, holly in hand, light glinting off snow, footprints deliberately placed to guide behavior. The sense of control he had cultivated for decades slipped like snow through fingers. In a final, desperate gesture, Ewan lunged toward the path leading to the moor, hoping perhaps to escape into the darkened folds of the forest, but Hamish was ready. With a swift but controlled movement, he intercepted, guiding Ewan back toward the cottage, neutralizing the threat without violence. The tension in the air broke like ice over a frozen stream, replaced by the quiet understanding of inevitability. Ewan sank to his knees in the snow, the weight of defeat settling heavily on him. I only wanted to preserve the story," he whispered, eyes downcast. Hamish nodded, allowing the confession, the explanation, the release of obsession to pass naturally. He had all the pieces, now aligned, and the dangerous calculus of decades-long grievance had been exposed fully. The village, still asleep under the snow, remained unaware of how close it had come to further tragedy. Hamish stood quietly, the soft crunch of snow beneath his boots marking the first step toward resolution. The crime had been orchestrated with intelligence and obsession, but patient observation, careful deduction, and an understanding of human nature had brought it to light. Beneath the Christmas snow, justice had been restored, and the shadows that had haunted the village would finally begin to recede. Hamish Macbeth stood in the snow outside the Maclean cottage, the soft glow of lanterns illuminating the frost-sear. Stead windows. Ewan Fraser, subdued and compliant, had confessed fully to the planning and execution of the murders. His motives laid bare, the obsession with erasing the past, controlling the narrative, and punishing what he perceived as slights against the memory of Alastair. The village, he knew, would be relieved once the authorities took Ewan away. Yet as Hamish watched the snow settle in quiet layers across the moor, an unease settled in his chest. Something niggled at the edges of his mind, a faint irregularity in the sequence of events, a detail too subtle to have mattered at first, but now refusing to be ignored. He returned to the Maclean cottage, entering without ceremony, scanning the familiar rooms for one last piece of the puzzle. His eyes lingered on the places that had drawn his attention throughout the investigation, the mantelpiece where the photograph had been, the crushed holly on the floor, the faint dust patterns on the window-sill. Then he saw it. A small envelope, tucked beneath the rug near the fireplace, unnoticed in all previous searches. It was unassuming, nondescript, with no markings except for the faint indentation of handwriting on the outside. Hamish bent to retrieve it, brushing away snow that had been carried in by boots or wind. The contents inside were startling, letters, meticulously folded, written in a hand he recognized. Not Ewan's. He read quickly, piecing the words together, and his pulse quickened. The letters revealed a plan, a manipulation, orchestrated over months, perhaps years. The final, shocking revelation. Ewan Fraser had been the instrument, but not the originator. Someone else had nudged, pressured, and guided him, exploiting his obsession with the past to commit murder and misdirection. The handwriting, the phrasing, the subtle instructions. It all pointed to a mind both cunning and patient, someone intimately familiar. With the village, the families, and the histories involved. Hamish felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. The true mastermind was someone no one had suspected, Morag Maclean herself. The woman, poised and grief-stricken, had directed events from the shadows, carefully manipulating Ewan's obsession to serve her own ends. The murders, the disappearances, the misleading evidence, all had been designed to remove perceived threats, to punish those who had wronged her or her family, and to ensure that the past conformed to the story she wanted preserved. She had watched, waited, and nudged, using human weakness as a weapon. Hamish's mind raced, reconstructing the timeline with this new revelation. The crushed holly, the placement of the photograph, the subtle manipulations of villagers' perceptions, all made sense now. Morag had known precisely how Hamish would approach the investigation, how he would interpret clues, and how the snow, the footprints, and the timing could be used to mislead him. The real danger, he realized, had been hidden under the guise of grief and victimhood, the very things that had lulled the village, and him, into a false sense of closure. He stepped outside again, boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground, and considered the implications. Ewan Fraser, however dangerous, had been a tool. The true genius behind the chaos had been Morag, her obsessive control over the past extending into lethal influence. The final twist tested Hamish's skill more than anything before, to confront the mastermind directly, to expose her without endangering the villagers, and to untangle the final, intricate web of deception before another life could be lost. He returned to the cottage and called Morag to join him, careful to maintain calm and composure. Her face, pale in the lantern light, betrayed nothing at first, but as Hamish spoke quietly, recounting the pattern of manipulation, the letters he had found, and the deliberate orchestration of events, a flicker of something, fear, anger, recognition, crossed her eyes. Hamish knew then that he had struck at the heart of her control. "I know what you've done," he said evenly. "You and Fraser acted, yes, but under direction. The true plan, the motive, the orchestration, all of it points to you. The past you sought to control has spilled into the present, and now it ends here." Her composure cracked, just slightly, a shiver passing through her as if the weight of her carefully concealed actions pressed down at last. Hamish watched, patient and steady, understanding that this moment, the exposure of the true mastermind, was the last, crucial move in a long game of observation, deduction, and psychological insight. Beneath the Christmas snow, the final truth had emerged, challenging even his seasoned mind, and bringing the investigation to a climax far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Hamish Macbeth held Morag MacLean's gaze steadily, his eyes unflinching as the lantern light reflected in the snow-dusted windows. She shifted, ever so slightly, caught between defiance and recognition of inevitability. The letters in his hand were irrefutable, her meticulous instructions, the subtle psychological nudges, the careful orchestration of Ewan Fraser's obsession, all of it traced directly back to her. Every twist, every disappearance, every misleading clue had been part of her plan. Yet even as he presented the evidence, he sensed the calculation in her demeanour. Morag had lived decades under the weight of her own narrative, shaping it with precision, and she understood instinctively that confession would bring consequences. Instead, she offered calm, controlled words, almost theatrical in their placidity. "Perhaps," she said, "it was necessary. Would you say otherwise if the past demanded Eustace?" Hamish remained composed. "It wasn't justice," he replied evenly. "It was obsession. An obsession kills far more than it preserves. I can prove how you manipulated every element, from the brass button to the holly from the footprints, to the phrasing you instilled in the villagers. Every detail was a deliberate misdirection." He recounted the sequence for her, quietly and methodically. The pattern of footprints across the moor, the placement and removal of the photograph, the letters that guided Ewan Fraser like a marionette, the disappearance of Ian MacDougall as a show of dominance. Each act, when viewed through the lens of her influence, became clear. Hamish explained how a single offhand phrase, the edge, had revealed habitual thinking, and how the subtle gestures of those around her had unwittingly played into her plan. He detailed the crushed holly, the wiped frost, the missing button, and the faint smudges, all physical manifestations of her manipulation, overlooked by everyone but himself. Morag listened, expression serene but guarded, a flicker of acknowledgement passing through her eyes. Hamish saw the way she weighed his words, calculating, assessing risk and perception. Then, with a subtle shift, she smiled faintly and stepped back, almost imperceptibly. In the split second that followed, she moved toward the edge of the moor, disappearing into the white folds of snow and shadow. Hamish lunged instinctively, but she was already gone. The realization struck him. The mastermind he had so carefully unravelled had chosen freedom over capture. Ewan Fraser would face justice for his actions, the village would recover from the fear that had gripped it, but the true architect, the one who had orchestrated everything with cold, precise calculation, had escaped. He stood in the snow, the crunch under his boots sounding unusually loud in the stillness. The sense of unfinished business settled over him, a cold reminder that even when patterns are revealed and motives understood, human cunning can sometimes slip through the narrowest of cracks. Yet he allowed himself a quiet satisfaction. The immediate threat had been neutralized, the web of deception exposed, and the villagers were safe. Morag. escape did not erase the trail she had left behind, nor the lessons embedded in every misstep she had taken. Returning to the village, Hamish called the remaining witnesses together, recounting the hidden clues they had overlooked, the habitual gestures, the small phrases, the deliberate placement of objects. He explained how even their own actions had been guided by the unseen hand of Morag MacLean, revealing why some inconsistencies had always seemed oddly staged. The villagers listened in awe, realizing the depth of the orchestration and the brilliance required to anticipate behavior so completely. Hamish knew that justice had been partially served. Ewan Fraser would answer for his crimes. The truth would reach the authorities. But the real mind behind the chaos remained at large, a ghostly presence over the snow-covered village. He understood, as he walked the quiet lanes, that not every story reaches tidy closure. Some truths linger, shaping memory, keeping a silent tension in the air, like footprints pressed lightly into the frost that vanish before anyone can follow them. Beneath the Christmas snow, life would return to a fragile normalcy, yet the memory of what had occurred would endure. Hamish, ever vigilant, felt a mixture of satisfaction and unease. The mastermind had slipped past him this time, but every clue, every pattern, every misdirection had been catalogued, and the intelligence of observation remained with him. Justice had been delivered where it could, and the lessons of the case, both human and forensic, would endure. Morag MacLean had escaped, but she had left behind her story in plain sight, and Hamish Macbeth, patient, perceptive, and unyielding, would be ready for her if ever she returned. The village lay under a quiet blanket of snow as Hamish Macbeth walked along the frozen lanes, boots crunching softly, each step echoing in the stillness. The air smelled faintly of pine smoke and frost, and for the first time in days he allowed himself to breathe in the calm, letting it soothe the tension that had gripped him since the first clue emerged. Ewan Fraser had been taken into custody, the immediate danger neutralized, yet the thought of Morag MacLean's escape lingered like a shadow behind his eyes. Hamish's mind wandered over the series of events that had unfolded. The brass button, crushed holly, wiped frost, vanished footprints, and the carefully orchestrated disappearance of Ian MacDougall. Each detail had revealed a layer of human obsession, manipulation, and control, but now he considered the small inconsistencies, the ones he had catalogued, noted mentally, but set aside amid the more urgent dangers. A footprint slightly too shallow, a phrase uttered with unusual cadence, a lock left partially secured, minor, almost negligible in isolation, but together they hinted at the presence of another observer, someone else who perhaps moved, unseen while the main drama played out. He paused at the edge of the moor, staring into the whiteness that stretched for miles, and noticed a faint impression in the snow. Too deliberate to be random, too subtle to have been caused by ordinary foot traffic. It was small, half-covered, but unmistakable, a set of tracks leading away from the village, almost invisible to anyone who hadn't been trained to notice such minutiae. Hamish crouched to examine them, the pattern strangely irregular, as though the person had paused, shifted, then retraced steps to avoid detection. A chill ran through him, not from the cold, but from the realization that another player might still be involved. The notion unsettled him, even as it intrigued him. The case had been solved in the sense that immediate danger had been addressed, and the visible perpetrators had been apprehended, yet the ring evidence, the cryptic tracks, the faint signals hidden in plain sight, the knowledge that Morag MacLean had escaped, suggested the story was not finished. Someone, somewhere, had been manipulating events from a distance, testing boundaries, and ensuring that even Hamish's careful observations could not capture everything. He rose slowly, brushing snow from his coat, and continued along the path that led back toward the village. Lights glimmered in windows, smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and the quiet chatter of villagers repairing their routines drifted faintly on the wind. Hamish reflected on the lessons of the case. Human nature was far more complex than any pattern could fully capture, and even the most meticulous plans could leave fragments behind. Fragments that might speak to the future if one paid attention. A small piece of paper, almost lost among the frost and litter near the edge of the lane, caught his eye. He stooped to retrieve it, careful not to disturb its fragile position. It was a note, brief, written in neat but unfamiliar handwriting. "The past is never dead. Watch closely." Hamish's eyes narrowed, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. The handwriting didn't match any of the known participants. It was a warning, a taunt, or perhaps an invitation to the next puzzle. The note confirmed his suspicions. The mystery, though outwardly resolved, was not over. He tucked the paper carefully into his coat pocket and continued walking, boots crunching along the snow, mind alert, senses tuned to every detail. The village appeared safe, but Hamish knew better. Beneath the calm surface, beneath the Christmas snow, threads remained, hidden patterns, unseen observers, and the quiet machinations of human obsession. As he rounded the last bend and the cottages clustered into view, Hamish paused to take in the scene, smoke rising from chimneys, lights glimmering warmly in the windows, and the faint traces of footprints in the snow, leading in all directions, some familiar, some mysterious. The immediate crisis had ended, yet the horizon was full of possibilities. The world remained unpredictable, the human mind still capable of secrets, and Hamish Macbeth, ever vigilant, understood that his work was never truly complete. He walked on, letting the village recede behind him, the soft wind carrying the faint rustle of trees and distant animal calls. A sense of closure mixed with curiosity filled him, satisfaction at having unravelled the visible threads of a complex web, and anticipation of what the faint footprints and cryptic message might reveal next. Beneath the Christmas snow, mysteries waited, patient and silent, and Hamish knew that when they surfaced, he would be ready, as always, to follow the trail wherever it led.